I should have known that night would change everything the moment the music started to feel too loud and the air inside the club felt too heavy to breathe. My name is Emily Carter, and until that night my life had been painfully ordinary. I was 26 years old, living in a tiny one-bedroom apartment that cost almost half my paycheck, teaching art to middle school kids who thought paint was better used on each other than on canvas. My biggest worry most days was whether my car would start in the morning or if I had enough gas to make it through the week. Nothing about my life prepared me for the moment I crossed paths with Adrian Romano. If someone had told me earlier that evening that one of the most feared men in the city would step into my life before midnight, I would have laughed and ordered another soda. The club had been my friend Jessica's idea. It was her birthday, and she insisted we go somewhere fancy for once. The place sat right in the center of downtown, a towering building of glass and neon that looked like it belonged in a movie about people with far more money than I would ever see. Inside, the music pounded through the floor like a second heartbeat and colored lights moved across the crowd in slow waves. I remember feeling out of place the second we walked in. The women around us wore dresses that probably cost more than my monthly rent. Men in tailored suits leaned against the bar like they owned the building. I tugged at the sleeve of my simple black dress and told Jessica we should probably leave after one drink. She laughed and dragged me toward the bar anyway. "Relax," she shouted over the music. "It's one night." The bartender slid a bright cocktail across the counter toward me, the glass sweating under the lights. I wasn't much of a drinker, so I took small sips, letting the sweetness sit on my tongue while Jessica danced beside me. For a while everything felt normal. People laughed. The bass vibrated through my ribs. Someone spilled a drink and apologized. Just another crowded Friday night in a city that never really slowed down. But then something changed. It started as a strange warmth behind my eyes, like the room had suddenly turned. Up the temperature 10 degrees. I blinked, thinking maybe the lights were too bright. When I tried to stand, the floor tilted slightly under my heels. I grabbed the edge of the bar to steady myself. My heart began beating faster, not from the music, but from a quiet alarm building in my chest. I knew my limits, and I had barely touched the drink. The noise around me started to blur, voices blending into a distant hum. I looked around for Jessica, but the crowd seemed thicker now, faces unfamiliar, movements slower and distorted like I was watching the room through water. That was when I felt a hand close gently but firmly around my arm. "Hey," a man's voice said near my ear, calm and confident. "You look like you need some air." I tried to answer, but the words stuck somewhere between my thoughts and my mouth. My legs didn't feel like they belonged to me anymore. The man guided me away from the bar, toward a dim hallway that led away from the main floor. Somewhere deep in my mind a warning bell started ringing. I wanted to pull back, to tell him I was fine, but my body moved half a step too slow. The hallway lights flickered softly above us, and the music from the club faded behind the door. That was the moment everything should have gone very wrong. But someone else had already noticed. I tried to focus on the man guiding me down the hallway, but my vision kept slipping in and out of clarity like a radio station losing signal. The bright noise of the club behind us faded into a dull echo, and the air in the corridor felt cooler, quieter, almost empty. My heels clicked unevenly against the polished floor, each step slower than the last. Something inside me was screaming that I should turn around, that I should find Jessica, or at least get back to the crowd, but my thoughts felt wrapped in cotton. The man kept one steady hand on my arm, not rough, not forceful, just firm enough that my unsteady balance leaned toward him. "Just a little fresh air," he said again, his voice smooth, like this was a normal thing that happened every night. I tried to speak, to say that I needed to go back to my friend, but the words tangled somewhere in my throat. The hallway stretched longer than it should have, lit by a row of soft overhead lights that reflected off dark marble walls. At the far end I could see a door that probably led to the back exit of the club. Cold night air. That was what my foggy mind told me. Fresh air would help. At least that was what I wanted to believe. My fingers tightened weakly around the strap of my purse as the floor shifted again beneath me. The strange warmth in my head had turned into a heavy pressure behind my eyes, and every sound seemed distant, like I was hearing the world from underwater. The man slowed slightly as we neared the door, glancing over his shoulder toward the main room. That was when another sound cut through the haze. Footsteps. Slow. Measured. Not rushing. Not loud. but deliberate enough that even through the fog in my head I noticed them. The man holding my arm paused for half a second, almost as if he had not expected anyone else to be there. I forced myself to look up. At the other end of the hallway stood a tall figure stepping out from the shadows near the corner where the corridor turned toward the private lounge. For a moment the light from the ceiling caught the sharp lines of a dark suit, perfectly tailored, the kind of suit you only saw on men who had people opening doors for them. He moved with a calm confidence that seemed completely out of place in the chaotic energy of the club behind us. My vision blurred again, but I could still make out the way the man beside me stiffened slightly. The newcomer did not hurry. He walked forward slowly, hands relaxed at his sides, his gaze steady and unblinking. Even in my dazed state, I could feel the shift in the air around us, like the entire hallway had suddenly become very still. When he spoke, his voice was low, controlled, and carried the kind of quiet authority that made people listen even without raising the volume. "Let her go." The words were not loud, but they seemed to stop time for a second. The man holding my arm forced a short laugh that sounded too quick, too rehearsed. "She is fine," he replied, trying to guide me another step. Toward the door. My knees nearly buckled, and I stumbled slightly. The stranger's eyes flicked to me for just a moment, sharp and assessing, like he could read the situation in a single glance. Something changed in his expression then. Not anger, not panic, just a cold certainty. He took one more step closer, the polished floor reflecting the shine of his shoes under the lights. Then he said quietly, each word precise and unmistakable, "Touch her again, and you will regret it." Even through the fog clouding my mind, I felt the grip on my arm loosen. The hand on my arm disappeared so suddenly that I almost lost my balance. For a second the hallway tilted again, and I had to reach for the wall to steady myself. The man who had been guiding me a moment earlier stepped back, raising both hands slightly, as if he had just remembered somewhere else he needed to be. "Relax," he said quickly, forcing a casual smile that did not quite reach his eyes. "I was just helping her get some air." The tall stranger did not respond right away. He stopped a few feet away from us, close enough that I could finally see his face clearly through the haze clouding my vision. Dark hair swept back neatly, a sharp jawline, eyes that were steady and unreadable, the kind of eyes that seemed to measure everything in the room without moving. There was something about the way he stood that made the hallway feel smaller, quieter, like the world had narrowed to that single moment. The man beside me shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable under that silent stare. "She asked for help," he added, his voice less confident now. I tried to speak, to confirm or deny it, but my mouth felt dry and my thoughts were still struggling to line up in the right order. The stranger's gaze flicked briefly toward me, taking in the way I leaned against the wall, the way my fingers clutched my purse strap as if it were the only thing keeping me upright. Something in his expression hardened slightly, though his voice remained calm when he finally spoke again. "She can answer for herself." The hallway grew very quiet. Even the music from the club sounded distant now, reduced to a faint pulse behind the thick door at the end of the corridor. The man who had brought me here hesitated another second before giving a short shrug. "Fine," he muttered. "Not my problem." Without another word, he turned and walked back toward the main room, disappearing around the corner with quick steps that echoed briefly before fading away. I stood there blinking slowly, trying to process what had just happened. My legs still felt unsteady, and the strange pressure in my head had not gone away. The tall stranger remained where he was, watching me carefully, as if deciding whether I was about to collapse. After a moment, he stepped forward and stopped an arm's length away, keeping enough distance that I did not feel cornered. Up close, he looked even more composed, the dark suit fitting him perfectly, the faint scent of expensive cologne cutting through the lingering smell of alcohol and perfume drifting from the club. "Can you stand?" he asked. His voice was quieter now, no longer carrying the edge of command from a moment earlier. I tried to straighten, but the floor shifted again under my heels. He noticed immediately. One hand lifted slightly, hesitating for a fraction of a second before resting lightly against my elbow just enough to steady me. The gesture was careful, respectful, like he was aware that I might pull away. "Easy," he said. "You are safe." Safe. The word echoed strangely in my mind. I studied his face through the blur of light and shadow, trying to decide if I should believe him. I had never seen this man before in my life. Yet the strange certainty in his voice made the panic in my chest ease just a little. "My friend," I managed to say slowly. "Jessica. I need to find her." He nodded once, as if that request made perfect sense. "We will find her," he replied. Then his eyes moved toward the drink still clutched loosely in my hand. His expression sharpened again. "But first," he said quietly, "you need to tell me exactly what you drank tonight." I tried to focus on his question, but my mind felt slow, like every thought had to push through thick fog before reaching the surface. The glass in my hand trembled slightly, the ice inside clinking together with a soft sound that seemed far too loud in the quiet hallway. I looked down at the drink as if the answer might be floating somewhere in the pale liquid. "Just a cocktail," I said, my voice unsteady. "Something sweet. I do not even remember the name." He took the glass gently from my fingers before it slipped completely. His movements were calm and precise, like someone used to staying in control even when everything around him was chaotic. He held the glass up toward the light for a moment, studying it with a quiet focus that made my stomach twist with unease. "Did you leave it unattended?" he asked. I tried to think back. The memory came in pieces. The crowded bar. Jessica laughing beside me. Someone bumping my shoulder. The moment I turned away to answer a text message that never actually came. "Maybe," I admitted slowly. For a minute. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He set the glass on a small table against the wall and turned his attention back to me. "How long ago did you start feeling like this?" I blinked, trying to measure time through the haze. 5 minutes. Maybe 10. My legs wobbled again, and he steadied me with the same careful grip on my elbow, guiding me toward a narrow bench along the wall. "Sit down for a moment," he said. I lowered myself onto the bench, grateful for something solid beneath me. The cool marble wall behind my back helped a little, grounding me in a world that still felt like it was slowly spinning. He stepped a few feet away then, pulling a phone from the inside pocket of his suit jacket. His voice was quiet when he spoke, but there was no hesitation in it. "Bring water," he said into the phone. "And find the bartender who served the woman at the main bar." There was a brief pause while someone on the other end responded. "Yes," he continued calmly. Immediately, when he ended the call, he slipped the phone back into his pocket and returned to stand in front of me. I studied him more carefully now, trying to understand why a complete stranger was suddenly taking charge of a situation that was clearly not his problem. Up close he looked even more composed than before, his posture relaxed but alert, like a man who noticed every small movement around him. People did not move like that unless they were used to being watched. "Why are you helping me?" I asked, softly. The question seemed to hang in the air for a moment. He considered it, his gaze steady on mine. "Because something is wrong," he said simply. "And because nobody should be alone when something like this happens." The answer was so direct that it caught me off guard. Before I could respond, 2 men appeared at the far end of the hallway carrying bottles of water. They wore dark suits similar to his, though neither of them moved with the same quiet authority. They slowed when they reached him, waiting as if for permission before stepping closer. One handed him the bottle. The other glanced briefly toward me before lowering his voice. "Everything is under control," he said. The tall man nodded once and unscrewed the cap, offering the bottle to me. "Drink slowly," he instructed. As I took a careful sip, he turned slightly toward the 2 men, his voice dropping just enough that I almost missed the next words. "No one leaves the building until we understand exactly what happened tonight." I took another slow sip of water and felt some of the pressure in my head ease slightly, though the world still felt softer around the edges, like everything was wrapped in a thin layer of fog. The 2 men in suits disappeared back down the hallway after receiving their instructions, their footsteps fading into the low pulse of music leaking through the walls from the main club floor. The tall stranger remained standing in front of me, his attention steady, patient, as if he had nowhere else to be even though everything about him suggested the opposite. I rested the cool bottle against my forehead for a second and tried to breathe evenly. "Thank you," I said quietly. He gave a small nod, acknowledging the words but not making a big gesture out of them. "You are starting to look a little better," he observed. I was not sure if that was true, but the room did feel less like it was spinning. "I still feel strange," I admitted. "Like my brain is a few seconds behind everything." His expression remained thoughtful, as if he had already expected that answer. "That will pass," he said calmly. "Water helps. Fresh air helps more." He glanced toward the door at the end of the hallway, the one leading outside, then back to me as if weighing the decision. We will go outside in a moment, he added. But I want to make sure you are steady first. I studied him again, the question that had been sitting quietly in the back of my mind growing louder. You never told me your name, I said. For the first time a faint hint of amusement touched his expression, subtle enough that someone else might have missed it. Adrian, he replied. The name sounded simple, but the way he said it carried a quiet confidence that made it feel heavier somehow. Emily, I said automatically, though he had never asked. He nodded once as if committing it to memory. The hallway lights reflected faintly in his eyes as he glanced toward the corner where the corridor connected back to the main lounge. A few people passed by the entrance now and then, but none of them came down the hallway. It was almost as if the entire space had become private without anyone officially closing it off. I took another careful drink of water and noticed something I had missed before. Every person who walked past the entrance glanced toward Adrian for half a second before quickly looking away again. Not curious looks. Respectful ones. Cautious ones. The kind of looks people gave someone they recognized but did not want to disturb. Do you work here? I asked, trying to piece together why the atmosphere around him felt so different from everyone else in the building. Adrian's gaze returned to me, thoughtful again. Something like that, he said after a moment. The answer was vague enough that it raised more questions than it answered. Before I could ask anything else, one of the suited men from earlier returned, stopping a few steps away from Adrian and lowering his voice. We spoke to the bartender, he said quietly. He remembers the drink. Adrian listened without interrupting. The man continued, glancing briefly toward me before finishing his report. There may have been someone standing near her when it was served. Adrian's eyes darkened slightly, though his voice remained completely calm when he replied. Find him. The man nodded and disappeared again without another word. I tightened my grip on the water bottle, suddenly very aware that whatever had happened tonight was far more serious than I had first realized. Adrian turned back toward me then, his expression softening just enough to ease the tension that had crept into my chest. Do not worry, he said quietly. You are not leaving here alone tonight. For some reason, the certainty in his voice made me believe him. I sat quietly for a moment, holding the bottle of water with both hands while the cool plastic pressed against my palms. The hallway felt calmer now, though the faint music from the club still pulsed through the walls like a distant heartbeat. My head was clearer than before, but the strange heaviness had not disappeared completely. Adrian stood nearby, leaning slightly against the wall with the relaxed posture of someone who was used to waiting without losing patience. Every few seconds his eyes moved toward the corner of the hallway where his men had disappeared, then back to me, as if he was measuring both situations at the same time. I studied him more openly now that my vision had steadied. There was something about the way he carried himself that made the entire space feel organized around him. People did not need to ask who was in charge. It was simply obvious. You said we would go outside. I reminded him quietly after a moment. Adrian nodded as if he had been expecting that. Yes, he said. Fresh air will help. He stepped closer and offered his hand, not grabbing my arm this time, simply giving me the option if I needed support. I hesitated for half a second before placing my hand lightly in his. His grip was steady but gentle as he helped me stand. My balance wavered slightly, but it was nothing like before. The hallway seemed straighter now, the lights less harsh. Together we walked slowly toward the door at the end of the corridor. Each step felt more solid than the last. When Adrian pushed the door open, cool night air rushed inside and brushed across my face. The difference was immediate. I took a deep breath and stepped outside onto a small private terrace behind the building. The city stretched out in front of us, glowing under rows of streetlights and neon signs. Cars moved along the avenue below, their headlights sliding across the pavement like thin white ribbons. Compared to the noise of the club, the outside air felt peaceful. I leaned lightly against the metal railing and breathed again, letting the cool wind clear the last bit. A fog from my thoughts. Adrian stood beside me, not too close, giving me space while still keeping a careful watch. Better? He asked. I nodded slowly. Much better. For a few seconds neither of us spoke. The quiet felt comfortable, like the world had paused long enough for my mind to catch up with everything that had happened. Finally, I turned toward him again. You still have not explained something, I said. His eyebrow lifted slightly in curiosity. What is that? How you knew something was wrong with my drink? The question seemed to interest him. He looked out over the city for a moment before answering. Because I have seen it before, he said simply. More times than I would like. His tone was calm, but something in the words carried experience behind it. I watched him carefully, realizing that the confident stranger who had stepped into that hallway earlier was not someone who acted on impulse. He had noticed something most people would have ignored. Before I could say anything else, the terrace door opened quietly behind us. One of the suited men stepped outside, approaching Adrian with quick but respectful steps. We found the man from earlier, he said in a low voice. Adrian did not react with surprise. Instead, he gave a slow nod, his eyes calm but focused. Good, he replied. Then he glanced toward me briefly before turning back to his employee. And the bartender? The man nodded. He confirmed the drink was tampered with after it left the counter. Adrian's gaze darkened slightly as he absorbed the information. The city lights reflected faintly in his eyes as he looked back toward the club behind us. Then we have our answer, he said quietly. The words settled into the night air between us, quiet but heavy enough that I felt them in my chest. Then we have our answer. I tightened my grip on the railing and looked down at the street 10 floors below, where traffic moved normally, people laughing on the sidewalks, taxis sliding past under yellow lights. It felt strange that the world down there continued like nothing had happened while I was still trying to understand how close I had come to something I could barely name. Adrian turned slightly toward the man who had delivered the message. His posture remained calm, but the shift in his expression told me the situation had become serious in a way that had nothing to do with me personally. Where is he now? Adrian asked quietly. The man answered immediately. In the lounge near the back corridor. He does not know we are aware yet. Adrian nodded once as if that was exactly what he expected to hear. For a moment he said nothing else, his gaze drifting across the city skyline before returning to the terrace door behind us. I noticed something subtle then. The man who had come outside stood very still while Adrian thought, waiting in the same way people waited for a decision that would not be questioned. Good, Adrian said finally. Keep him there. The employee nodded and stepped back toward the door, but Adrian stopped him with a quiet word. Discreetly. The man understood immediately. Of course. He disappeared inside without another sound, leaving the terrace quiet again. I exhaled slowly, realizing my shoulders had tensed without me noticing. Adrian looked toward me then, his expression softer than it had been during the conversation. You should not worry about that part, he said. It is being handled. I studied him for a second, trying to understand the calm certainty in his voice. Handled how? I asked. He considered the question before answering. By making sure it never happens again. The way he said it carried a quiet finality that made me believe he meant exactly what he said. I looked back toward the glowing city and tried to steady my thoughts. I still cannot believe this actually happened, I admitted. I came here for my friend's birthday. That was all. Adrian stepped beside me at the railing, his hands resting lightly on the metal bar. Life changes direction in small moments, he said. Sometimes you do not see it coming until it is already happening. The words sounded more thoughtful than dramatic, like something learned from experience rather than philosophy. I glanced at him again. You talk like someone who has seen a lot of strange nights. A faint smile touched the corner of his mouth. More than most people. For a moment we simply stood there, the wind brushing across the terrace while distant sirens echoed somewhere far down the avenue. Then Adrian's phone vibrated quietly in his pocket. He glanced at the screen, reading a short message before locking it again. Your friend Jessica is still inside, he said. One of my people confirmed she is safe. Relief rushed through me so suddenly that my knees almost weakened again. Thank you, I said softly. Adrian nodded once. You can see her in a moment. He looked back toward the club doors, his expression turning thoughtful again. But first, he added quietly, there is something you should understand about tonight. I frowned slightly. What do you mean? Adrian's gaze returned to mine, steady and direct in the glow of the terrace lights. The man who followed you, he said. He did not choose this club by accident. I stared at Adrian, trying to understand what he meant. The wind on the terrace suddenly felt colder, brushing across my arms as the words echoed in my head. He did not choose this club by accident. I straightened slightly from the railing and looked at him more carefully. What does that mean? I asked. Adrian did not answer right away. His eyes drifted toward the glowing windows of the building behind us where the muffled music still pulsed through the walls. For a moment, he looked like someone assembling pieces of a puzzle that had already begun forming in his mind. This place attracts certain kinds of people, he said calmly. Some come for the music. Some come for the reputation. I frowned slightly. And some come for other reasons? Adrian glanced back at me and gave a small nod. Yes. The simple word carried a quiet certainty that made my stomach tighten. I thought about the man from earlier. The way he had appeared beside me so easily. The way he had offered to guide me outside like it was the most natural thing in the world. You think he planned it? I asked slowly. Adrian rested his forearms on the railing beside me, looking out over the street again. I think he was waiting for an opportunity, he said. Crowded places make that easier. I followed his gaze down to the line of taxis pulling up outside the club entrance. People stepped out laughing, unaware of anything unusual happening above them on the terrace. The city felt so normal from a distance. That is terrifying, I admitted quietly. Adrian turned his head slightly toward me. It is also why places like this have people watching, he said. The way he said it made me realize something I had missed earlier. You were not just walking through that hallway by chance, were you? I asked. A faint hint of amusement appeared in his eyes again. No, he said. I was observing the room. That answer made several small moments from earlier suddenly make sense. The way he had noticed the drink. The way the staff seemed to know him without introductions. The way the entire hallway had fallen silent when he spoke. You own this place, I said slowly, the realization forming piece by piece. Adrian did not confirm it immediately, but the slight tilt of his head was enough of an answer. I let out a quiet breath, feeling both surprised and strangely relieved at the same time. So you really were watching everything, I said. Most of it, he replied. The terrace door opened again behind us, and the same suited employee stepped outside once more. He approached Adrian and spoke quietly. Jessica Carter is near the front lounge. She is asking about her friend. Adrian nodded and gestured slightly toward me. Bring her here. The man disappeared again without hesitation. I felt a wave of relief move through my chest. She must be worried, I said. Adrian looked back toward the skyline, the glow of the city reflecting in his calm expression. She will be relieved to see you are safe. I leaned against the railing again, letting the cool air steady my thoughts. I guess I owe you more than one thank you tonight. Adrian shook his head slightly. You owe me nothing. I studied him for a second, still trying to understand the quiet authority surrounding him. Most people would have ignored something like that, I said. It was not my night to ignore it, he replied. His voice carried a calm finality that made the moment feel heavier than a simple explanation. The terrace door opened once more, and I heard hurried footsteps approaching behind us. Jessica's voice came first, breathless with worry. Emily. I turned quickly just as she stepped onto the terrace, her eyes wide with relief the moment she saw me standing beside Adrian. Jessica rushed across the terrace and wrapped her arms around me before I could even say a word. The force of the hug made me stumble slightly, but this time my balance held. Oh my God, Emily, she said breathlessly. I have been looking everywhere for you. I hugged her back, feeling the tension finally start to drain out of my shoulders. I am okay, I said softly. Just a little dizzy earlier. Jessica pulled back and looked at my face carefully, like she was checking every detail to make sure I was telling the truth. You disappeared, she said. 1 second you were at the bar, and the next you were gone. I glanced briefly toward Adrian, who still stood quietly near the railing, giving us space but clearly paying attention to everything happening around us. Someone tried to help me outside, I explained slowly. But Adrian stopped it. Jessica followed my gaze and finally noticed him standing there. For a moment she looked confused, then curious. Adrian stepped forward slightly and gave a polite nod. Your friend felt unwell, he said calmly. She needed some air. Jessica blinked, clearly realizing there was more to the story than that simple sentence. Well, she said after a moment. Thank you for helping her. Adrian inclined his head slightly in acknowledgement, but he did not turn the moment into something dramatic. Instead, he glanced toward the terrace door where his employee had reappeared, standing quietly a few feet away. The man waited for Adrian's attention before speaking in a low voice. Everything is taken care of, he said. Adrian nodded once, and that was the end of the conversation. No details, no explanation, just quiet certainty that the situation had been resolved. Jessica noticed the exchange and raised an eyebrow. You have very efficient staff, she said lightly. Adrian allowed himself a faint smile. They are good at their jobs. The wind shifted across the terrace again, carrying the distant rhythm of the club music into the night air. I realized that the strange heaviness in my head had almost completely faded now. The world finally felt steady again. Jessica slipped her arm around my shoulders. Maybe we should head home, she suggested gently. I nodded in agreement. The excitement of the night had turned into something else entirely, and all I wanted now was quiet and sleep. Adrian stepped aside as we moved toward the door, but before I crossed the threshold back into the building, I turned to look at him again. Thank you, I said, meaning it more than the simple words could explain. Adrian met my gaze for a brief moment. The terrace lights reflected softly in his eyes, and his expression carried the same calm confidence that had filled the hallway earlier that night. You were never in danger once I saw you, he said quietly. The words were not dramatic. They were simply certain. Jessica gently tugged my arm, guiding me back toward the club entrance where the noise and lights waited on the other side. As we walked down the corridor together, I glanced back one last time. Adrian Romano still stood on the terrace, looking out over the glowing city as if the entire night had been nothing more than another moment in a long list of responsibilities. But somehow I knew that meeting him was not the kind of moment life simply forgot. It was the kind that changed direction quietly, without warning, and only revealed its meaning much later.